What's really interesting is that the Egyptologists were certain that they would find Akhenaten behind that tomb, and they didn't.
Imagine opening a royal tomb and finding a mummy with a crushed skull, a torn-away face, and gold jewelry bent tight around the bones. That is what scientists uncovered when they re-examined the body from Tomb 55, Akhenaten's lost grave.
This is at KV 55 in the Valley of the Kings, away from the public eye. Most Egyptologists and archaeologists are baffled and have a lot of questions.
The violence in the coffin, the stripped names, and the shattered gold make one thing clear. Someone tried to destroy this king long after he died.
When they first opened this tomb, they found little remains of hieroglyphics on this wall that says the evil one should not live again.
Inside the most confusing tomb in the Valley of the Kings. Deep in Egypt's Valley of the Kings lies tomb number 55, a small and almost forgotten chamber that many experts now think once held Akhenaten, the ruler whose choices turned Egypt upside down. Back in January of 1907, the tomb did not even have a number yet. Excavator Edward Ayrton was digging there for a wealthy American lawyer turned amateur archaeologist named Theodore Davis, who had a permit to explore the valley. On January 6th, Ayrton cleared debris and saw that bedrock steps dropped down toward a blocked doorway. He reported the find to Davis, and on January 9th, the two men, joined by artist Joseph Lyndon Smith and Inspector Arthur Weigel, broke through the seal and went inside. The entrance was not wide or grand. A short stairway cut into the rock led down to a straight, sloping corridor. The whole passage and chamber together measured only about 90 feet long, tiny compared to the deeper, branching tombs of famous pharaohs nearby. The walls were roughly plastered but bare. In the back room, masons' red guide marks and a half-started niche in one wall showed that a larger plan had once been sketched out and then abandoned. The whole place felt like a project that had been stopped halfway and then reused in a hurry. Even before the team reached the room at the bottom, they could tell the tomb had a rough history. The outer doorway showed not one, but two blocking walls. The older wall, made of fitted limestone and plastered, had once carried the official seal of the royal cemetery, the jackal and 9 bound captives. At some point in ancient times, that first wall had been broken open and the tomb was invaded. Later, workers had thrown up a second, loose wall in front of the first, as if someone wanted to shut the place again but did not care enough to rebuild it properly. Inside the passage, rubble filled the floor almost knee-deep. Dark streaks on the ceiling and walls showed where water had seeped in down the tunnel. When Ayrton and his men finally cleared a path into the burial room, they stepped into a space that looked less like a king's eternal home and more like a storeroom after a storm. The first thing that caught their eye was not the coffin, but the wreck of a great golden shrine. Large gilded panels lay on the floor and leaned against the walls. The surviving parts later showed that the shrine had once been covered with scenes of a king and an older royal woman making offerings to the sun disk. Inscriptions on the panels made clear that the shrine had been made by Akhenaten for his mother, Queen Tae. His names had been hacked out and, in some places, replaced in red ink with the name of his father, Amenhotep III. Whoever did this wanted the mother honored, but the son's name erased. Around the room lay other broken goods. There were rotten wooden boxes on the floor, their contents spilled out everywhere. Among them were small ritual objects from the opening of the mouth ceremony, a ritual meant to help the dead breathe, see, and eat again. There were seal impressions naming Tutankhamun, a fragment of a silver goose head, bits of furniture, and discs from a gilded funeral cloth. All of it looked battered and watermarked, covered with fallen plaster and chips from the ceiling. It felt like someone had swept parts of a royal house into one small room and walked away. In a niche cut high into one wall, Ayrton's team found 4 fine stone jars. These were canopic jars, the containers that once held a person's internal organs. Each alabaster jar had a lid carved as the head of a young woman in a close-fitting wig. A later study showed that the jars and their first inscriptions were made for Kia, one of Akhenaten's lesser wives. Her name and titles had been carved out, and a royal cobra had once been added to each jar to show they were being reused for a king. Even those cobra symbols had been broken off in anger. Near the coffin and in other corners of the room lay 4 small mud magic bricks. These bricks were part of a protective set that should be placed around a royal coffin, each one bearing spells and the name of the dead person. Their hieroglyphs named Osiris Neferkeperur Wenre, which is Akhenaten's throne name, written in a way that shows him as Osiris, the god of the dead. All 4 bricks were set in the right positions around the coffin, pointing strongly to the idea that the final owner of that coffin was Akhenaten himself. Against one wall lay the coffin that had started so much debate. It was covered in gold, decorated with colored stones, and had once rested on a lion-headed funeral bed that had since rotted away. The lid showed a figure with crossed arms, but when you look closely, strange details start to appear. The shape of the body and the style of the wig matched coffins made for royal women, not men, yet a false beard had been added, and the hands had once held the crook and flail that mark a king. Every oval name ring that should have carried a royal name had been chiseled out, and the most violent damage of all was on the face. The golden mask over the face had been torn away from just under the eyes, ripping out any trace of the person's features and leaving the coffin blind and nameless forever. Inside the coffin, wrapped in decayed linen, lay a body that was already in awful shape when the tomb was opened. 2 visiting doctors took a quick look in the valley and told Davis the skeleton was female, which matched his hope that he had found Queen Tiye's tomb. Excited, he rushed his book into print and titled it The Tomb of Queen Tiye. A few months later, in Cairo, anatomist Grafton Elliott Smith examined the bones more carefully and showed that the remains belonged to a young man with broad hips and an oddly shaped skull. From that point on, the tomb was no longer a simple queen's burial, but a mystery male tied by its objects to the most controversial royal family of the time. The physical state of the body disturbed even hardened scientists. Water had seeped into the coffin through cracks in the ceiling over many years, soaking the lower part of the burial. Reports describe the lips as dried and leathery, and the teeth as so fragile they turned to dust at a touch. When Smith tried to feel through the chest wrappings to find jewelry and amulets, the body simply collapsed. The bones came apart, the dried flesh crumbled, and everything mixed with the dirty water in the bottom of the coffin. Witnesses later spoke of a sludgy mess of mud, bone powder, and fragments of gold and beads at the bottom of the case. Workmen were quick to see value in that mud. As the remains broke down, tiny gold elements and inlaid pieces stuck in the sludge were scooped up and kept by some of the crew. Years later, Davis had to buy back bits of jewelry and plaque fragments that had clearly come from the coffin. Other pieces vanished into private collections and auction houses. Even the main body of the coffin went missing for many years, until scholars finally traced most of its gold covering to a museum in Munich and had it returned to Egypt. The body itself ended up in Cairo as a loose skull and scattered bones, packed in a basket after the softer parts had turned to dust. On top of this decay came signs of deliberate attack. The skull shows damage that looks like a stone had been thrown at it, crushing part of the head. A wide gold pendant in the shape of a vulture, a piece of royal chest jewelry called a pectoral, had been bent into a ring and forced around the skull so that the bird's tail hung over the forehead like a twisted crown. The more scholars looked at the objects, the harder it became to see this as a random burial. A shrine made for Queen Tiye, jars made for Kia, magic bricks naming Akhenaten by his throne name, seals linked to Tutankhamun, furniture tied to Amenhotep III. It looked less like a normal tomb and more like a small cache of Amarna period royals that had been moved, rearranged, and then partly torn apart in hate. The wreckage in tomb number 55 left Egyptologists with a painful mystery. Whose bones had been buried here, and why had someone tried so hard to wipe him from history? How science revealed the true identity of the KV-55 mummy. The old way to study a mummy was to unwrap it by hand and poke around, but if anyone tried that here, they would destroy what little was left. The only choice was to learn as much as possible, while harming it as little as possible. And at first, that had to be done with nothing more than trained eyes and simple measuring tools. This was how Grafton Elliott Smith determined that the body was male. He looked at the skull, checked the jaw and teeth, measured the long bones in the arms and legs, and examined the pelvis to decide if the body was male or female. From the wear on the teeth and the way the bones had finished growing, he guessed the man had died in his early 20s. That age estimate caused a huge problem. From written records, people already knew that Akhenaten had come to the throne as a teenager and ruled for about 17 years, which means he likely died in his mid-30s. A skeleton that looked barely older than 20 did not seem to fit. Other doctors later checked the bones and came up with similar young ages, often around 20 to 26. For many years, most books repeated the same story. The body from tomb number 55 was a young male, too young to be Akhenaten, and must instead be a short-lived king like Smenkhkare. The case seemed closed, and that view dominated the field for decades. But the skeleton was in bad shape, and everyone knew it. Bones had been soaked by water for centuries. Soft tissue had turned into a kind of crust on the surface. Parts were missing. That kind of damage makes age estimates much harder. Even in healthy bodies, judging age from bones alone is not an exact science, and with this one, it was worse. Egyptologists needed a way to open the body without cutting one more piece, and that meant machines, not knives. In the early 2000s, a team led by Zahi Hawass began to push for a full medical study of key royal mummies, including the one from tomb number 55. They moved the skeleton into the Egyptian Museum and slid it into a large tunnel-shaped machine called a CT scanner. A CT scan is basically many X-ray pictures taken in thin slices, which a computer then stacks into a three-dimensional model. Instead of peeling away wrappings or scraping at bone, doctors could now look through the skull, spine, and joints on a screen, zoom in on tiny details, and even rotate the image, all while the real bones stayed untouched. The CT images told a very different story from the early eyeball guesses. The growth plates at the ends of the long bones were fully fused, which happens only in adults. The surfaces of the joints showed wear that does not match a teenager. The teeth were more worn than you would expect in a man of just 20 or 22. On top of that, there were small changes in the spine that tend to appear in middle age. When specialists put all those clues together, the best fit was not a youth in his early 20s, but a grown man somewhere between his mid-30s and mid-40s. That range suddenly lined up well with a king who had taken the throne as a teenager and ruled for roughly 17 years. The scan also showed that this man was far from healthy. The spine had a sideways curve known as scoliosis, which can make standing straight and walking more tiring. The roof of the mouth had a gap called a cleft palate, a birth defect that can cause problems with speech and eating. There was a small growth or damaged area in one of the facial sinuses in the skull. The upper part of the thigh bone showed signs of collapse or a benign bone tumor, which would have made every step painful. These health issues matched a broader pattern seen in the royal family. CT scans of Tutankhamun, for example, also suggest a partial cleft palate and spinal curvature, and his tomb contained over 100 walking sticks, many of them clearly used. The medical study of the dynasty showed that spine problems and other bone defects repeated in several members of the line. None of this proves the identity of the man in tomb number 55 by itself, but it shows he fits into a family that was passing on more than just crowns and gold. To move beyond he looks like an adult with health problems, the team then turned to DNA. Hawass and his colleagues took bone and tissue samples from 11 or more royal mummies. That group included Tutankhamun, his presumed grandparents Amenhotep III, and Queen Tiye, the couple Yuya and Thuya, two female mummies from tomb number 35, and the male from tomb number 55. They copied and compared repeated sections of DNA, like barcodes, to see which individuals shared the same patterns and how those patterns could fit together into a family tree. The results were striking. The man from tomb number 55 shared his father's markers with Amenhotep III and his mother's markers with Queen Tiye. At the same time, he matched as the biological father of Tutankhamun, who also inherited part of his code from a woman in tomb number 35 known as the Younger Lady. In simple terms, the DNA test showed this sequence: Yuya and Thuya as great-grandparents, Amenhotep III, and Tiye as grandparents, the male from tomb number 55, and the Younger Lady as parents, and Tutankhamun as their son. That means the anonymous skeleton sits exactly between Amenhotep III and Tutankhamun on the family tree, which is the place Akhenaten is expected to occupy in history. The medical data also changed how people see this man as a person. For years, artists and some writers imagined Akhenaten as almost inhuman, with a very long head, wide hips, and strange, soft features. Some thought he might have suffered from rare genetic syndromes that caused a feminized body. When the team studied the bones and scans, they did not find clear signs of those dramatic conditions. They saw a slim but otherwise normal male skeleton, with no proof of swollen breasts or warped skull joints. The images suggest that the alien look in art was probably a style choice tied to his beliefs, not a simple copy of his medical state. Knowing who this broken body almost certainly belonged to only makes the larger mystery sharper. If this really is Akhenaten, how did a king born into one of Egypt's richest courts end up dumped in a small plain tomb, far from the proud desert city he built for his new god? To answer that, you have to step back from the bones and go out into the cliffs and valleys to the royal tomb he planned for himself and the chain of choices that tore that plan apart. Inside the desert tomb, Akhenaten chose for himself. In the 5th year of his reign, Akhenaten left the old cities behind and picked a stretch of empty land on the east bank of the Nile, roughly halfway between Memphis and Thebes. He called it Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten. He did not go there for a short stay. He carved his promise into the cliffs on huge rock tablets called boundary stelae, saying that he and his family would live there and be buried there, in the desert land he set aside for his new god. The land he marked out was huge. Modern surveys suggest the sacred zone stretched around 20 to 25 kilometers across the valley, which is roughly 12 to 15 miles, and about 13 kilometers from north to south, which is about 8 miles. On both sides of that area, he carved more of those boundary texts into the rock. In them, he swore that he would not build tombs for himself or his family anywhere else, not in Thebes, not in the old royal cemetery, but only in the cliffs around Akhenaten. He was breaking with the past in a very physical way. Even his grave would turn its back on the Valley of the Kings. Behind the city, a desert valley cuts into the cliffs. Today, it is called the Royal Wadi. A smaller side valley branches off from it, about 6 kilometers or roughly 4 miles from the entrance. At the end of that side valley is the doorway to the royal tomb, known to archaeologists as tomb number 26 in the Amarna rock tomb list. That tomb was carved for Akhenaten himself and for some of his closest family, his young daughter Akhenaten, his mother Tiye, and possibly Nefertiti in an unfinished side room. When explorers first went inside in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they found that most of the decoration had been smashed, but enough survived to show what the king had in mind. On the walls, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters stand under the rays of the sun disk, the Aten, which reaches down with small hands to touch them. This is not the usual world of Egyptian tomb art, full of gods with animal heads and long spells for the afterlife. There is almost no trace of the Book of the Dead here. Instead, there are large scenes of the royal family alone, worshipping the Aten and walking in and out of the palace. In the chambers tied to Akhenaten, a very young princess, one set of scenes shows her lying on a bed while Akhenaten and Nefertiti stand nearby with their hands to their faces in clear grief. It looks like a mourning ritual, carried out under the hard light of the Aten, rather than in the soft dark of the old underworld gods. Pieces of stone from the tomb tell us that Akhenaten and his mother Tiye were once placed there. Fragments of a large stone sarcophagus carry Akhenaten's names and show him under the Aten's rays. Other fragments and later finds in the Valley of the Kings link Tiye to this same tomb. Blocking walls, broken and rebuilt in the corridors, show that the tomb was opened and closed more than once in ancient times. Chisel marks, missing chunks of carving, and rough holes cut in the walls all point to a long history of damage. By the time modern teams reached it, the royal tomb at Amarna was already stripped of its main burials. The spaces for the king and his family were there, but the bodies and their rich coffins had gone. Outside the tomb, the world had changed just as violently. Akhenaten had shut temples to other gods, drained power from the old priesthood, and poured money and labor into his new city and the Aten cult. After his death, everything shifted. Within a few years, new rulers began restoring the old gods, especially Amun of Thebes. In later texts, rulers like Horemheb said they were setting things right after a period of confusion. Akhenaten's name was cut out of stone blocks, his images were smashed, and some writings refused to name him at all. They called him only the criminal, or that enemy. In that climate, leaving his grand tomb in a city built for a hated god was not an option. Archaeology at Amarna shows how deep the revenge went. Work at the site has found that within a couple of decades of Akhenaten's death, large stone buildings in the city were pulled apart on purpose. The standard small limestone blocks he had used, called talatat, were lifted out and hauled away to build new temples for later kings in other cities. Excavations at places like Hermopolis have found whole walls made from these reused Amarna blocks, many still carrying carved scenes of Akhenaten and his family, but now hidden inside the cores of new shrines. The city itself slowly emptied, house walls crumbled, sand filled the streets. By the time the new kingdom ended, Akhenaten was a ruin, a king who had sworn to live and die, only there was now treated as a mistake that needed to be covered up. This backlash reached right into his grave. When the royal court returned to Thebes under Tutankhamun, many scholars believe there was a kind of funeral move. The bodies from the royal tomb at Amarna were taken out of the desert valley and carried to the older royal cemetery. Evidence for this comes from the mix of objects and remains in Theban tombs. The basic idea is straightforward. The royal tomb at Amarna once held Akhenaten, Akhenaten, and Tiye. Later, when the city was abandoned, people opened the tomb, gathered the royal mummies, along with some of their burial goods, and moved them to the Valley of the Kings. There, the bodies were placed in older rock-cut tombs instead of being given new grand monuments. One of those resting places was tomb number 55. The mix of pieces in that small chamber makes sense if you picture a team emptying the Amarna royal tomb in a hurry. They grab Queen Tia's gilded shrine. They grab the canopic jars that had once been made for Kia. They keep the magic bricks that name Akhenaten, and they set them up again around a single coffin in a side tomb near the main Theban cemetery. At some later point, perhaps in the time of the priests who cleaned up royal burials in the 21st dynasty, Tia's body is moved again, this time to the larger hidden cache in tomb number 35, where she was found in the 1880s. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.